testing the microphone. If you can hear me, can you please reply in the chat? We are testing the microphone. We're testing it. Does it? Okay. It's just, it's not. Oh, you know what? Okay, now I can see it. It's because of the sunlight. I couldn't see the green dot. It is on. I just couldn't tell. While the sun shines down equally on everything, making bodies and pavement hot, sweat drips, and a cool breeze blows. Yeah. That's how meditation practice works too. Sometimes it feels like it's kind of on fire, and then Yeah. Welcome in today from the 10 directions. Good morning. If you are at home watching, if you have the 3 refuges in English, please feel free to follow along. For those who are present, can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. I've tried to put on my teacher voice today. For those present, please repeat after me. I go for refuge to Buddha. My deeply awakened mind. The living source of understanding and compassion. Which must be cultivated to be known fully. I go for refuge to Dharma. The path of mindful living. Leading to healing, joy, and enlightenment. The way of peace. Which must be cultivated to be known fully. I go for refuge to the Sangha. The loving and supportive community of practice. Realizing harmony, awareness, and liberation. Which must be cultivated to be known fully. I am aware that the 3 jewels are within my heart. I vow to realize them. I vow to understand living beings and their suffering. I vow to cultivate loving kindness and compassion. And to practice joy and equanimity. I vow to live simply and sanely. Content with few possessions. And to keep my body healthy. I vow to let go of all worry and anxiety in order to be light and free.
I vow to let go of all worry and anxiety in order to be light and free.
I am aware that I owe so much to my parents, teachers, friends, and all beings.
I am aware that I owe so much to my parents, teachers, friends, and all beings.
I vow to be worthy of their trust,
I vow to be worthy of their trust,
to practice wholeheartedly, so that understanding and compassion will flower, and I can help living beings be free from their suffering.
and I can help living beings be free from their suffering.
May the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha support my efforts.
May the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha support my efforts.
May the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha support my efforts. May the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha support my efforts.
May the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha support my efforts.
Good morning again. Well, sitting here in the sun in a cloudless sky, or nearly cloudless, can be a little uncomfortable, but I find discomfort makes us a little more attentive to our lives. Remember that for later. So a short Dharma verse today. There is no supposed to. There is no not supposed to. Just work with what is present. This is our human job. Maybe you've been involved in conversations, been the subject of one, or even been the initiator of such a conversation, either inside your own head or about other people, of, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Christian, I'm a father, I'm a mother, I'm a manager, I'm whatever it is that I think that I am, and I'm not supposed to do this. I'm not supposed to be this way. I'm not supposed to feel like this, or I am supposed to be like this or be that way. There's actually, there's a truck always parked in the parking lot where I work. I don't know whose truck it is, but it has a sticker on the back. I call this bumper sticker Discourse. It says, "Are you following Jesus this closely?" Yeah. So the implication, of course, is that you have this kind of identity, and are you sure you're living up to the ideal that you have? And so sometimes we judge ourselves according to the ideal that we espouse or aspire to. Sometimes we judge people according to the ideals that we have, or we judge them according to the ideals that we think that they hold, because that's what they are. They're this thing. We're this thing. We have this identity that says who and what we are. It determines what we're supposed to be doing. Well, I call this the suffering of identity. Actually, I didn't call it that. The Buddha called it that. I'm just talking about it. I didn't make any of this up. So. Actually, I am going to read this quote that I just picked up from an article I was rereading yesterday called Waking Up to Whiteness from Greg Snyder. And he said, there can be a strong impulse to want enlightenment to be some all-consuming one-shot missile with an infinite blast radius, not the slow and vulnerable embodiment of insight and discernment intimately expressed through ongoing cultivation and effort. Emphasis on the ongoing cultivation and effort. The notion of all-powerful enlightenment allows us to maintain a sense of invulnerable superiority toward life and all others in it, rather than remaining humbly in the trenches of our limited humanity. So in some ways, these labels that we have for identities for ourselves, at one point I was given a Wadu practice, which is an inquiry practice. I carried a question: what is the one thing? And after carrying that question for years, I finally realized not one thing, not two either, but not one thing. Because whatever that one thing is constant transformation, unimpeded difference, the whole of plurality. And so there is no supposed to be. You're not supposed to feel a certain way. There's just what is present. There's just what shows up in this body and mind. And you're not like, oh, well, that's not supposed to be here. It's like, I'm going to, let's pull that out of here. I'm supposed to be kind. I'm supposed to be compassionate. I'm supposed to be this. Well, sometimes we mess up. But as that quote says, it's like, this is a process. It's an ongoing process. And it's ever unfolding, just like life, just like nature. And so we cause ourselves all kinds of suffering with a sense of identity because we try to cling to things. These are my ideas. These are my perceptions. This is my body. The stuff that happens in it is mine. But reality is kind of messy and it's complex and it's full of processes that are ever unfolding, and it's just constant transformation. So being Buddhist is kind of an unfortunate way of putting it, actually. Most people historically, so Buddhist is a term that we started using in the West to describe people who are practitioners of Buddha Dharma, people who are followers of the teachings or hearers of the teachings of Buddha. And so we're practitioners, and if we're practicing, that means we're in an ongoing process. And as I said a little bit ago, discomfort makes us more attentive to our lives. And this process that we're engaged in involves looking at this constant process of self-identification. How do we keep creating this sense of identity over and over and over again? And so there's a sutta, actually, it's becoming one of my favorites. It's a discourse given by Dhammadinna, one of the great female disciples and arhats. And she goes through this sense of self-identity using the frame of the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths quickly is, so I'll do it in the frame of identity. There is this identity. There is a cause of self-identification or identity. There's a cease from the process of self-identification. And there's a path that leads away from or to the relinquishment of the process of self-identification. And so what is identity? But before we get to that, there's a little story. I've told it before, but it's almost more applicable right now. It's actually because identity is a relationship in which we stand to other constructed identities. It's a relationship in which we stand to ourselves, to things external to us. And in this particular story that was told to me by my teacher of somebody that she knew, and it's the identity relationships between a mother and a daughter. And it's a very simple case, but it illustrates the point beautifully, which is that the mother teaches violin. She is a violin teacher, also a mother. The daughter is her daughter, also her violin student. And every time they got together to do a lesson, it would almost always degenerate into yelling and screaming and anger and frustration. This became the habitual pattern. It ended this way almost every time. And the woman started coming to the temple. She started meditating. She started reflecting on the teachings and thought, okay, I need to do something different here. I like Musham's shirt that they're wearing right now. It says, what if? What if I just decided to relinquish this attachment to this process? What if I decided to let that go? This is the part where I said, remember, discomfort makes us more attentive to our lives, because this is really, really uncomfortable. And so the mother and violin teacher decided, what if I just decide to do this differently? I'm going to breathe. I'm going to pause before I say anything. I'm going to evaluate how it is that I'm interacting right now. And she came back and reported to my teacher, Haji. She said, when I did this and it did not degenerate into screaming, yelling, I wanted to throw up. Because we become habituated to our identities, even if they cause us suffering, they become so comfortable that it becomes really uncomfortable to let them go because they're so familiar, right? I think we have some experience with this. If you have something in your life that it's not really helping you and it's not really serving you, but you just keep doing it anyway because, well, it's a little bit scary because you're not sure what that territory looks like on the other side of not doing that. And so Dhammadinna, to come back, says that that identity is composed of clinging. And so first we have to note that, we have to see that and acknowledge it, that it's clinging to stuff of this body, that's in this consciousness. I have these ideas. I really like these ideas. These ideas make me feel powerful. They make me feel special. They make me feel different from everyone else. They're mine. I like the way that I perceive the world. So there's a strong emotive quality. We get our emotions involved in the development of views of ourselves and views of others. And so the cause, of course, then of this self-identification process is the craving for drawing stuff in to make and build this identity. And it's also the craving for what's called non-existence. And what we mean by this is that it's actually a craving for pushing something away. It's a craving for not having something around, like, I don't want this here. This isn't part of me. I noticed once as I was training in academics, you start sort of feeling like you're part of a higher area of the social ladder, as it were. And I was like, I noticed that as I was talking with my other academic friends, that I started to develop dislikes and aversions to things that I used to like, that I thought were okay. But now I was refined. You know, I had lots of complex ideas. And so I realized, like, this identity I was building around my academic persona was a bunch of carefully constructed aversions. Like, I like these kinds of foods because, you know, they have flavor, they're complex, and they're special. I still like those foods, but yeah. And so we start to notice these things about how we interact and create and build these identities for ourselves. And so we draw things in, or we push things away. We create aversion. So we create this sense of self in relation to other things that we don't want around, or that we think, like, we push those away, like, I'm better than that. Or I draw it in. We do this with, so in some ways, the creation and process of creation of identity is really like a consumption. There is a way of translating the term that we use for, like, attachment, has like this baseline meaning of, like, to consume or to feed, actually. The word is failing me in Pali that it comes from, but it's translated as attachment or grasping or craving, but it has this notion of to feed. And so self-identity is like self-consumption. I like to see myself reflected back in the world. The world reflects myself back to me, and I like that. And I don't like it when I can't see myself in the world. And so we suffer when we can't see it. And so we constantly renew this process. We have a teaching called Dependent Origination. I invite you to go look at it. I'm not going to go through it because it would take like the rest of the morning. But it's really about the arising of suffering existence within the human personality. And it's about this constant renewal of being, the renewal of identity over and over again. It's this sense of rebirth of identity, like, here it is again. I'm going to consume more material. I'm going to go out and I'm going to go on a social media crusade, and I'm going to keep building this identity, and I keep renewing it by the things that I say and the things that I do, the movies that I watch, the music. Have you ever felt that sting when somebody doesn't like your favorite song? You know, it's like people don't like your music. They don't like the books that you read, and you're like, oh, but that's me. It's not your book, right? Why do we do that? Why do we grab onto those things? Why do we cling to those things? We're just sort of setting ourselves up for it. And so Dhammadinna then goes through the third noble truth, which is that there's a ceasing of identity, or the process of identification. I'm going to keep calling it the process of identification. It sounds a little heavy and burdensome to say that, but the Buddha doesn't really talk in terms of like things that do and do not exist. They're processes. And so even when we talk about mind, what we mean is the thinking process. When we talk about identity, we mean the process of self-identification with things that are not actually me. And so the first two noble truths tell us what it is and what the cause of this process of self-identification is. The teachings of dependent origination show us how we constantly renew and consume this sense of identity, just bringing it into being, constantly enacting it. The third noble truth says that there is a relinquishment, or there is a ceasing to the process of self-identity, that it is actually possible. We can ask that question, what if? What if I just didn't do this thing that I always do, or think this thing that I always do? Or what if I just stayed quiet instead of always being the one to have to speak? And I actually just listened for a change. Something different might happen. That might be uncomfortable because normally I always have to have the first and last word. You know, that's kind of true, actually. And so then we move to the fourth noble truth of the process of self-identification, which is that there's a path leading out of that. And ultimately, it's of course, the Eightfold Path. But in particular, I would highlight our meditation practice, which in this case is partly the development of concentration. So this is one element of our practice. When we develop our concentration, we get what the Buddha called keto vimutti, which is the release of the mind. And in many cases, it's in the context of a temporary release of the mind. So when the mind becomes deeply concentrated, we become quiet, we focus on the breath and nothing but breathing. Concentration arises. We get a sense of wholeness in this body and mind, a sense of unity, and we get a release from the thinking process, because the process of self-identification is a thinking process. It is wholly created by the mind renewing and consuming things that constantly renew the sense of identity. And so this thing that we can do different is develop concentration so that we create this spaciousness to say, what if I did something different? What if I decided to relinquish this identity, as scary as that might be, so that when you get off the cushion and you've practiced relinquishment and you've understood and experienced release, you can take that into the world and take those choices into the world and say, what if I just listened this time? What if I didn't say the stuff I feel like saying right now? A lot of times other people just say it anyway and you don't have to. Or what if I chose a compassionate response instead of the one that I might ordinarily? Maybe I get angry when my identity is challenged. What if I stopped, breathed for a minute and said, what do you mean by that? It gives us the chance to pause, to breathe, and to create that spaciousness where we can choose to do something different. And our identity can become more fluid. It can move with what is happening. I mean, the Buddha Dharma is, in some sense, a skillful sense of identity. It's an identity that we create in order to overcome, suffering identity. I can call myself a practitioner of Buddha Dharma, but that's a skillful way of saying I am somebody who is in the process of attempting to relinquish this constant process of self-identification so that I can be more fully and wholly with others. And so going back to the verse, it said, just work with what is present. This is our human job. Maybe some people say, like, I'm done talking about this. I don't want to talk about this anymore. I don't want to talk about race. I don't want to talk about white and black identities anymore. Let's move on. Because that's what we usually do. We get really excited. We get angry. And then we're like, yeah, okay. Well, we spent that. We spent that energy. Well, I'm going to talk about it again today. Because in a lot of ways, our sort of postmodern world right now is the attempting to come to grips with identity and understanding the suffering of different identities, organizational identities, religious identities, social identities, racial identities. We're finally coming to grips with the fact that there isn't some kind of special essence that makes things what they are. but we keep trying to renew that. We keep trying to find it. We want it. We keep craving for that essence. Sometimes we go to maybe you've gotten like tarot readings. You've gotten we're sort of seeking this identity. We're like, please tell me what I am. I just want to know what I am. Please tell me. We start looking outside and we start drawing things in. And so what's happening right now is we are investigating and becoming yet again more fully aware of racial identities. And there is a whole sector of the population who has the privilege of not actually having to understand what that identity is. And so we actually can make a distinction. I got this from Kwame Anthony Appiah when I used to teach ethics. I used to teach philosophy once upon a time. And I used many articles from Appiah. And he dubbed it racialism, that what stands behind what we call racism is something called racialism. It's this idea that there's some kind of essence that makes different kinds, that makes people separate. And that racism then takes these qualities and actually weaponizes them in a sense, that the characteristics which we find, we try to pin down as an essence that says, that's what this person is. And then we actually then decide through racism that there's something wrong with these characteristics and that we need to enter into a different kind of relationship. Maybe it's a relationship of oppression. And so we're grappling with the fact that we have co-created these identities. We have to take responsibility for these identities for which we have all now created. And we come to realize that there is no essence to these things, right? And so I love the beginning of the discourse with Dhammadinna. It's actually her former husband, which is a really funny story why she's advising her husband, which you can consult a earlier talk from Susan on that. I won't go through the story because it's not really relevant, but it's funny. And he says, identity, what is identity? What is this process of self-identification? And she's like, well, it's clinging. That's what it is. It's clinging to the stuff, to characteristics, to actions. There's nothing else beyond that. There's no core, there's no essence that we can say, there it is, I found it. That's what it is. That's what makes it what it is. And so as we get on the social media bullhorns, and sometimes we might be tempted to go on these crusades, it's not bad to talk about these things, but I think we should be careful about the kind of discourse that we engage in while we're doing it, because some things that I've seen which concern me a lot, because I'm really concerned about speech and right speech. This is really the most difficult of the noble path, the Eightfold Path. Right speech is a very difficult one to engage in and to do well. And what I notice is a lot of people engaging in what ends up being kind of self-congratulatory discourse, which really just becomes another form of self-identification. Like, what's that new term that people use? Is it, I'm woke? Is that it? I'm behind the times. I'm not aware of these things very well, and so we get involved in these kind of self-congratulatory discourses that say, like, I'm so woke. All of me and my friends are so woke. We're talking about all the right things and we're saying all the right things. And we can celebrate it all together. And then it just becomes another process of self-identification. And so what I'm interested in is just pointing out to everyone that there is this process of self-identification, this kind of consumption pattern of wanting to see oneself reflected, and ask that question, what if We just decided to do something different, and do not cease the observation of how it is that you're participating in speech and discourse and participating in the creation of this identity. Because ultimately, waking up to what you are is not about you. So I'm going to say that again. Waking up to what you are, waking up to what we are, is not about you. What is it that we wake up to when we practice? What is the one thing which is numinous and never dark? That's not one thing, but not two. I think I am going to read this. I have something here that I shared privately because I didn't feel like I needed to be the first one to speak, and I wanted others to speak first. But these were just born out of some contemplations, kind of in the evening when I was just contemplating what's happening right now. Because relinquishing the process of self-identification means just looking at what is and what's really happening and acknowledging what's really happening and the damnable, gritty reality of it. So I had written, the practice of Buddha Dharma is the practice of breathing. Breath is life. Breathing is living. When we bow, we pay homage to just this life with our whole body. When we sit and meditate, we clarify this breath. Breathing alone together, we witness living liberated within this great life. We clarify life. Right now, George Floyd cannot breathe. Right now, Black Americans cannot breathe. Right now, Black and brown bodies around the world cannot breathe. The breath of this great life labors unliberated under the weight of persistent, habitual, racialized identities. It labors under the weight of historical and present identities created by others that we now, right this moment, continue enacting. How do we relinquish identities which we never created but presently defined, are defined by, and recreate every waking moment? The intertwined identities of Black and non-Black Americans were forged together and will be relinquished together. Liberation is the birthright of all who live. We are liberated together, or we are not liberated at all. This is the Bodhisattva Vow. And so it's up to us to ask, what if I relinquished this identity? It starts with just saying, I have no idea how to do that. Don't know mind. And confronting the scariness of what might be waiting on the other side. However, what might be on the other side might be freedom. That's not so bad. And what's important about engaging our concentration practice and being released from the thinking process, being released from identity, is that all of the other identities that we have created and that we are related to now have nowhere to land. So that in the case of the mother and daughter, when she ceased her part of that identity relationship, the daughter's identity relationship had no place to land. The thinking process had nowhere to go. And so the fire just goes out. That's enough for today. We'll have a short sitting. Might want to stretch your legs for a moment. And briefly, before we close, I'm sorry we forgot to do this last week, the short version of our sharing of merit ceremony. We were fumbling around a bit, trying to figure out how to do Dharma in the parking lot, and we neglected this. And so, from the ceremony, inequality among all beings, with open-hearted compassion for those who are facing any mental or physical challenges, who are sick, being treated for sickness, suffering isolation and loneliness, or close to death, or suffering the constant production of identity. We now hold it all in our hearts and minds. So I'm going to read the numbers as of this morning for COVID-19, because let's not forget that's still happening too. So in Kent County, 4,338 cases and 127 deaths. In Michigan, 63,009 cases, 5,907 deaths. In the United States, 2,459,472 cases and 124,976 deaths. And worldwide, 9,825,539 cases and 495,388 deaths. And I say, by the virtue collected and the grace received through our Dharma activities of body, speech, and mind, we now dedicate this great field of merit for the transformation of suffering into the causes of awakening the hearts of all sentient beings. And being mindful of everyone's time this morning, we'll just end with the 4 great vows. Please repeat after me. All beings, one body. I vow to liberate. Endless blind passions. I vow to uproot. Dharma gates without number. I vow to penetrate. The great way of Buddha. I vow to attain. Each moment at a time. Thank you for joining us online. Thank you all for joining me here in the parking lot. go home and have some tea. That's what I'm going to do.
Anyone wants to go in front of the camera just to wave. Leave it on for a minute. It's nice for them to see who all showed up.
Look, people really came.
Who all's out there? About 10 people out there.
Could you, that part you read at the end, I think it was your own contemplation. Could you send me a copy of that?
Sure.
That's wonderful. I mean, I'd really like to be able to contemplate that and think about that. Good. Thank you.
If I forget, just send me a message, because I often forget things like that by the time I get home.
Tommy Bahama here.
My Greek outfit when I go to Greece.